Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Brian Liddy and thank you for joining us this Friday evening. I'll go into today's Ukraine update before I introduce this evening's guest. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused Russia of planning to destroy a hydroelectric dam in the eastern Kherson region, where Ukrainian soldiers have been steadily advancing and Moscow-installed authorities have begun what they call evacuations of civilians. Russia has hit at least half of Ukraine's thermal generation capacity since the 10th of October, but not all stricken power units have stopped working completely, Herman Halushenko, Ukraine's energy minister, said today. Russia's defense ministry said a telephone conversation has taken place between the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, and his US counterpart, Lloyd Austin, today. The statement says, topical issues of international security, including the situation in Ukraine, were discussed. 6 people were injured this morning in a Russian strike at an object of industrial infrastructure in the city of Kharkiv, according to the regional governor, Ole Syniehubov. The UK Ministry of Defence has claimed Russia orchestrated a distraction campaign by announcing that 70,000 Belarusian troops would be involved in a new Russian-Belarusian group of forces. It is unlikely that Russia has actually deployed a significant number of extra troops into Belarus, and the announcement is likely an attempt to convince Ukraine to divert forces to guard the northern border, according to British intelligence. A Russian court has ordered the arrest of television journalist Marina Ovsyannikova, local media reports. Ovsyannikova, who was under house arrest, has already fled Russia, her lawyer said last week. The European Union must remain united in its support for Ukraine and should start working on holding Russia legally accountable for its activities in the war, the Latvian Prime Minister Krišjānis Kariņš said on his way to the second day of an EU summit. France will invite the leader of Moldova to Paris in November to express France's solidarity for the country in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the French President Emmanuel Macron said at an EU meeting. Iran deepened its involvement in Russia's invasion of Ukraine by providing technical support for Russian pilots flying Iranian-made drones to bomb civilian targets, the White House confirmed. The UK is implementing new sanctions on 3 Iranian individuals and a business responsible for supplying Russia with drones used to bombard Ukraine. And the EU has previously agreed sanctions against the same business and 3 individuals. Tehran denies supplying the drones to Moscow, while the Kremlin said the West is seeking to put pressure on Iran with accusations that Moscow is using drones made in the country. So I'm really pleased to say that tonight we're joined by Linda Fabiani. Good evening, Linda. How are you doing?
Hi, Brian. I'm fine, thank you.
Yeah. Maybe we could just, is there anything that was mentioned in today's Ukraine update that struck you? Anything that you want to?
Yeah, it's the Iranian involvement that's bothering me somewhat, Brian. I'm glad that the UK and indeed the EU are sanctioning individuals and companies as far as the EU is concerned. I think it's really worrying that we've got this regime in Iran which has terrible internal stuff going on just now as well. The way they're treating women, and now they're being a bit of a rogue in relation to Ukraine. So I think that's worrying. I know it's private companies and individuals that are getting blamed for the drones, etc. But I would be interested to know, will we ever know though, the link between the Kremlin and the government of Iran as well? I've seen some speculation, but nothing very concrete. But I think that's a worrying development.
Thanks, Linda. It's interesting, as you say, to remind ourselves about what is going on in Iran in
Yeah.
general with women. And also just to mention quite a lot of mentions of the EU there. And with the current political situation here in Britain, I'm just reminded that although we don't really have a prime minister at the moment, the EU seems to be getting on quite well without us in supporting the Ukraine. So anyway,
Yes, indeed.
so tonight's first story. Penny Mordaunt, the leader of the House of Commons, has become the first person to announce her candidacy for the Conservative Party leadership, her second such attempt this year. Ms Mordaunt, a former Defence Secretary, was eliminated in the fifth round of the previous Tory leadership contest, losing out to Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss. Announcing her bid, Mordaunt tweeted, "I've been encouraged by support from colleagues who want a fresh start, a united party and leadership in the national interest." Ms Mordaunt is not considered the front-runner, but has about 17 public endorsements. She's likely to hope that formally declaring her candidacy could trigger enough people to swing in behind her before the deadline to reach the threshold of 100 Tory MPs by 2 p.m. on Monday. The former Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, and ex-Prime Minister Boris Johnson are considered the leading candidates, with 68 and 36 endorsements respectively. There are mounting calls for a general election as UK voters demand a say in who will be Prime Minister. Labour leader Keir Starmer is arguing the country cannot afford another experiment with the top of the Tory party, he says, with voters also believing it is time to return to the polls. The SNP has ramped up calls on Liz Truss to reject the allowance of up to £115,000 per year offered to former Prime Ministers after she trashed the economy and resigned after just 45 days in office. Truss is able to claim the huge amount under the Public Duty Cost Allowance, or the PDCA, but is under mounting pressure to reject it at a time when households and businesses are being forced to pay a heavy price for the Tory-made cost of living crisis. Responding angrily to reports that Liz Truss will hand out resignation honours, the SNP's Tommy Shepherd MP said, "This just speaks to how corrupt the Westminster system is, that a failed Prime Minister who in just 44 days crashed the economy and caused untold chaos can reward her supporters and pals with peerages is an absolute disgrace." The Scottish Greens said that reports that Liz Truss is to hand out resignation honours would show how broken, corrupt and unfit for purpose the whole archaic system is. A petition on Friday, calling for a general election, attracted more than 730,000 signatures, while a YouGov poll found that 63% of voters want the new Prime Minister to call an early general election. So, Linda, there's quite a lot to unpack in there.
Aye.
Mordaunt, maybe the first out of the starting blocks, a bit like a whippet, but she's far from the favourite, as the report said that we just read out. Sunak, it seems, is on 68 MPs support him, even though he hasn't put his hat in the ring yet. Boris on 36, including Jacob Rees-Mogg, by the way, and Mordaunt on 17. For me, I mean, we can talk about anything here that you want, Linda, but for me, the thing that sprung first into my mind is that we're going to have, by Monday afternoon, we're going to have the third Prime Minister on the back of one single general election. So it's like buy one, get two free, which might be it might be fair enough. That's how they do things in the Tory party. But these new Prime Ministers get to come up with new policies that we didn't get to vote for, and they're in the process of breaking manifesto promises.
Mhm, mhm.
What, I don't know, what do you think?
Well, Brian, where to start? The whole thing's a complete and utter farce. You know, people have been saying the UK system's broken. Gosh, it's more than broken. It's absolutely shattered into pieces. And I mean, the Tories got elected in a manifesto. What was that? December 2019. A manifesto which I didn't agree with. But it seems that most of them didn't agree with it either, because then you get Liz Truss coming along, completely trashing it all the way through her leadership campaign. She campaigned on stuff that was anti their manifesto, and got elected by the Tory members. And here we are again, as you say, third one coming along, though it may be a recycled first one, who knows? Which is another whole talking point, the absolute disaster that is Boris Johnson, still under investigation for a lot of things, and folk are saying that he might stage a comeback. It's absolutely ludicrous, the whole blooming thing. And then, as you say, there's so much to unpack, everything else that's in there. The potential of Liz Truss after 44 days getting a lifetime allowance as a former Prime Minister. She was a disaster. And the one that really sticks in my throat, the very idea that she can be creating honours and sending people of her choice to the unelected House of Lords, who will then be in a position to be making legislation. It just makes me so very, very angry. Goodness knows who should be sending along there. It's just ridiculous. As I say, it's more than broken, it's shattered. It's time for a complete overhaul. It's time we were out of there. Why anybody thinks we should remain part of this in a country like Scotland that could be so successful, I do not know. And while I'm on my rant, I'll tell you what really annoys me as well is that we have an opposition there, the Labour Party, under Keir Starmer, who are being so mealy mouthed about everything. Now, I know they want to win an election, and there should be one immediately, but it doesn't look like there will be. The Tories are going to hang on there by their fingernails until the last possible moment. But we have a Labour Party which, they don't even have the guts to be standing up and saying we'd abolish the House of Lords, immediately at the very first opportunity. They allow this system, this archaic system, to carry on and can't even make a promise that they'll change it. It's almost like they just want their shot at government in the UK. That's what's important to them, and not make any real changes. And I just wish that Scottish Labour would have a look at that and say, is that really what we want to be supporting? Is that really what we're part of? Because they are a UK Labour Party that thinks the House of Lords is okay. So I am so disappointed in what's called Scottish Labour. They're not Scottish Labour at all. We've got nobody down in Westminster apart from the SNP, Plaid Cymru, Greens, and a couple of fairly honourable individuals who will stand up against this complete nonsense that is Westminster government.
Thank you, Linda. I've got a couple of
Right, I've
scenarios.
stopped, Brian.
No, not rant away. Anyway, they're not rants. They're very considered contributions. But I've got a couple of potential scenarios I thought
Yeah.
I'd like to run past you. You mentioned Starmer and the Labour government. I don't know if, like me, you might have seen some tweets recently by journalists saying that they've been speaking to members of the Conservative cabinet or other Tory MPs who are saying that if Boris Johnson gets back in as leader, then they're going to defect to the Labour Party. And that, to me, the first thing that reminded me of was Better Together in the run up to the referendum, when Labour and Tory seemed to be happy to work together. Do you think Starmer would be happy to take those Tory defectors, or would he say thank you? No, would he get his barge pole out and push them away, or would he welcome them?
No, he'd take them. He took one not that long ago. I can't remember the fella's name. There was a Tory that crossed the floor comparatively recently. And when you actually looked at what this guy had voted on and stuff, you're like, what on earth is the so-called Labour Party doing, taking these people in and welcoming them? And what really strikes me about this, there's been a couple of Tories have said, or at least one, again, the names I'll just go over my head, can't remember them, who said, if Boris Johnson comes back in, I'm going to leave the Tory party and stand as an independent. Okay, I get that. But see the ones that say, I'm going to leave the Conservative Party and cross the floor to Labour, and the idea that Labour would take them on. You just think to yourself, do none of these people have any principles? Because the reason I joined a political party was because I believed in what they stood for. And I campaign and continue to campaign for what the SNP stands for: independence and social policies that I think are decent and good. how can you have a Tory party and a Labour party who think their members are interchangeable, who think that it's okay for people to just jump about to preserve their jobs, because that's what it is. It's self-interest. It's preserving their job, regardless on which bench they sit. I just think it's disgusting, actually. No principles at all. People that would do that and people that would accept it. They're one and the same. Better together, as you say, Brian. Very together.
Thank you, Linda. The other scenario that I was going to run past you, there's a lot of talk about a general election at the moment, and there was a recent poll, I think it was today or yesterday, that said if there was a general election tomorrow, then the Conservative Party would end up with one MP in the whole of the UK. Just the one, I can't remember who the poll was by, a voice in my ear might be able to tell me. So that then made me then think ahead to, the same poll also said that the SNP, not the Liberal Democrats, would be the second biggest party and therefore the official opposition. So I'm thinking about, Starmer has said in the past that he would not work with the SNP in any way, shape or form. No collaboration in Westminster with the SNP MPs. Do you think the SNP would want to go into a coalition with, that's the word I've been searching for, with the new Labour government, or would you think they would rather, again, would they get their barge pole out and say, no, we'll stay on the opposition? Do you think, how would that one maybe play out?
Well, I wouldn't be there to, and I wouldn't be party to any of these decisions, but I would absolutely think that it would be very, very difficult for the SNP to be in coalition, whether formal or informal, with any party who was so opposed to the democratic mandate of Scotland. For example, in saying, yes, Scots are entitled to a referendum and self-determination. So the idea of linking up with any bunch of folk that would deny Scots democracy is anathema to me. And I would hope that it would be anathema to my party as well.
Thank you, Linda. We'll move on then to the next story. Millions of people in the UK are struggling to pay their bills, according to the City Watchdog, which said a growing proportion of the population is having trouble making ends meet. A survey by the Financial Conduct Authority, the FCA, laid bare the impact of the cost of living crisis, saying about 1 in 4, which is about 24% of adults in the UK, were either in financial difficulty or would fall into trouble if they suffered a financial shock. The FCA found that about 7.8 million people were finding it a heavy burden to keep up with their bills, an increase of about 2.5 million people since 2020, as wage growth failed to keep pace with soaring inflation at 40-year highs, currently at 10.1%. Meanwhile, 4.2 million people had missed bills or loan payments in the 6 months before the survey took place, in the 4 months between February and June. The financial challenges were concentrated in more deprived areas across the UK, with people in economically challenged regions roughly 7 times more likely to be in financial difficulty than their peers. About 12% of people in the North East and 10% in the North West were struggling financially, compared with 6% of people in the South East and South West. The statistics were gathered as part of the SCA's Financial Lives survey, which polled more than 19,000 people and will be published in full in early 2023. The government is believed to be considering raising benefits in line with wage growth of 5.5%, rather than inflation, which would put further pressure on already struggling households. The Resolution Foundation think tank has said it would have stark consequences for families, with a single disabled adult on universal credit likely to lose £380, while a working single parent with one child would lose £478 a year. A working couple with 3 children would lose £978. So, Linda, when I first read this item, the phrase which we use in the report, having trouble making ends meet, sounded almost quaint to me, quite old-fashioned, when really the opposite is true. I mean, this is biting, isn't it? The cost of living crisis laid bare, as we said in the report.
Mm.
That again, just kind of like thinking thoughts that pop in, associations. I'm thinking, do you agree? These people that are struggling to make ends meet, these are probably the same people that were told during the pandemic that they were vital frontline workers and more important than bankers. And after, when the pandemic was over, everything would change, and they would be valued. And then, of course, don't forget that Truss and Kwarteng planned a tax cut recently for high earners. Um, I don't know. Is there anything to that kind of train of thought?
I think there is, Brian, because, there was an awful lot of promises made during the pandemic, an awful lot of fine words were spoken. But here we are with it largely out the way. And as you say, those who were in the front line in public service are now getting hammered. And let's not forget, you mentioned bankers, that you're more important than the bankers, really? Well, they've had the cap on their bonuses lifted, and I'm not seeing any potential trickle down. So, yeah, it's always the same people that get hammered. It's the people who um, live day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year, with not a lot of cushion. Because most ordinary folk do not have that cushion of savings that will get them over hard times. If you can't pay your mortgage, you don't have a lot of grace period there before you're in severe trouble. And everything's gone up. So inflation's what the highest it's been for 40 years. We've got a real cut in wages. We've got a real cut in benefits. Looks like that's getting worse. Meanwhile, costs are rising in everything: food, energy, housing, everything. So, yes, it's really hard for people. And what struck me about this particular survey by the Financial Conduct Authority is that it's a big sample they've used. This is a serious study, and it'll be interesting to see the full results of it. Now, what any decent government should be doing is taking these things into account. We have a complete lack of any properly targeted assistance to people. Folk are now worried because, yet another U-turn by the Tories. I heard people saying they were quite relieved that, Liz Truss having announced the £2,500 average, thing for fuel, and how people were going to get help. That's gone. People now think we might get through the winter with this grant that's been given. What's going to happen after that? Nobody knows. The level of uncertainty is so stressful for people. And I'm really concerned too about, the same people that are getting put under stress are largely the same people that are expected to deal with society's overall well-being and stress as well. Frontline folk. And it's just so difficult all round. Meanwhile, as I say, those at the top of the scale, they're doing okay. And those that are making the decisions, and in an awful lot of cases, making the policies, and Liz Truss was the embodiment of that, those making the policies, ergo the decisions, are those that don't need to worry about such things.
Thank you, Linda. Again, still, we've probably got a minute or so that we can spare on this. There's so many thoughts going around my head.
Yeah.
For example, the 31st of October, we were told was going to be vital to the Truss administration, because that's when Jeremy Hunt was going to deliver his cost-aid plan to plug the black hole that has emerged. I think I might be right in saying that the size of that black hole that he has to plug is about the size of the amount of money that was wasted on test and trace during the pandemic. I think so many stories that we forget that they go back to things like the pandemic or Brexit or something like that. And then I really don't mean to be glib, but you were talking about rising prices. I mean, it's 95 pence I paid for a pint of milk the other day. And the pound is about to come down to parity with the dollar. So it's as if like the dollar and the pound and a pint of milk are going to achieve parity. Maybe we're going to get some kind of bartering system put in place. But I don't know. I've used up maybe all the time now. Is there anything in that Melly that you can pick out and make
Well,
sense of?
it's just everything that's covered over by, oh, it was the pandemic. I think we're beyond that now. And we're now turning on to, what some of these folk are saying. Oh, Brexit wouldn't have been a problem if it wasn't for the Remainers, causing the problem. Brexit is a problem. Brexit is still a problem. It's an ongoing problem. But it's the intransigence of those that lied to get there and who continue to lie about the results of it as well. That, coupled with the absolute self-interest that is there with so many people that are making our decisions, I think is the biggest problem of all. We're supposed to have this statement the 31st of October. That'll be lost now on all the fuss about this latest leadership contest and who we're going to end up with that's going to be the Prime Minister. And, yet again, there'll be another delay. Yet again, there'll be no targeting of resources at people who really need it. Yet again, folk are just getting left behind. And here we are, almost in the depths of winter, and we're not any further forward.
Yes, and yet again, probably whoever the new Prime Minister is, another set of policies that nobody's voted for and will be breaking their manifesto that they got in on. But we'd probably better move on now. The next story, or I don't like the word story, but the next item is NHS staff in
Yeah,
Scotland. Thanks, Linda. NHS staff in Scotland are set to receive a record pay rise of £2,205. That's an average 7% pay uplift to help tackle the cost of living crisis and retain staff during the tougher winter months. The increased offer was made after constructive negotiations between the Scottish Government and National Health Service unions, which lasted into the early hours of this morning. The offer would mean the lowest paid seeing a rise of more than 11%, with qualified nursing staff receiving up to 8.45%, helping the lowest paid staff through the cost of living crisis. If agreed, the pay uplift, which amounts to almost £500 million, around £480 million, will benefit more than 160,000 employees, including nurses, paramedics, allied health professionals and healthcare support staff. This is the largest pay offer given to NHS Scotland Agenda for Change staff since devolution and will mean they remain the best paid in the UK. If accepted, the offer will be backdated to the 1st of April 2022 and could be added to paychecks in time for Christmas, Humza Yousaf Health Secretary Humza Yousaf said, "I am grateful to trade union colleagues and NHS employers for constructive discussions on pay. This has been another exceptionally challenging year for our health service and we have a difficult winter ahead, but I am pleased that we are able to recognise the service and dedication of our healthcare and support staff with this pay offer. We owe NHS staff a debt of gratitude for leading us through the greatest public health crisis in recent history." So, Linda, again, my rambling thoughts. Scottish Government, it's clear, is trying to do its best to enhance NHS wages. But am I right in thinking that the amount they get to spend is directly linked to what the Westminster Government spends south of the
yeah.
border? So this improved pay offer probably means that money has been taken away from somewhere else that was maybe
Yeah.
already agreed in the SNP Greens budget. Do you think, I suppose, do you think this new offer is going to be accepted, or are we going to be seeing strikes this year in Scotland?
Um, Gosh, Brian, I don't know. I mean, I know that I read that the talks between the government and the trade unions went on to the wee small hours. I hope, that what's happened here is that the union will think that this is a fair offer. They'll put it to their members, but of course it's up to the members. I mean, the one thing I really am pleased about is, as I always am when I see this, is that those at the lower end of the scales, it works out they get a higher percentage than those at the top end. So I think it's 11% for those at the lowest grades and 2% for those at the top. So it's sort of narrowing the gap in a tiny way. It's just a tiny way because those at the top of the scale are well paid in comparison. So I think that's good. It's a big commitment by the Scottish Government. It's a lot of money, and yes, you're absolutely right, Brian. That has to come from elsewhere. So I think it's next week that John Swinney has confirmed that he will go with his budget to the Scottish Parliament and any changes that have been made. I don't envy him that task, I have to say, because my goodness, down the road's in a complete state of flux. There's already been a big reduction in the Scottish Government's budget. John Swinney must be, really trying to pluck things out of the air because he doesn't know what the policy of the new Prime Minister and the current Chancellor, let alone what maybe a new Chancellor will be making. And yes, Scotland's money comes from the Barnett formula, but then it's adjusted ongoing in relation to public expenditure by the UK government. So it's a really difficult job. I suppose it's a fair offer with the strictures under which the Scottish Government operate, but it doesn't meet likely inflation. I
Yeah,
reckon that they've pulled out the stops to do the very best that they can. It
yeah.
would certainly seem that way.
So it's chipping away at the wage gap then. But the voice in my ear
Yeah.
tells me that the Scottish Government budget is going to be announced on the 15th of December. So
All right.
we'll find out then, I suppose. So I'll move.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's probably the new budget coming along for next year, but I think he's got to report on changes to the current. Well,
Yeah,
yeah.
again, and
So
the voice in my ear again says there's going to be a spending review before then.
yeah,
But let's face it, something's probably going to come at us sideways and before
yeah.
then. So if we're going to let you get home on time tonight, Linda, we'd better move on. Scottish ministers have set out in the strongest terms their opposition to the transport strikes minimum service levels bill. The Transport Minister, Jenny Gilruth, has written to the UK Government to reiterate the Scottish Government's position that they will not support any proposals that seek to undermine legitimate trade union activity. Ms Gilruth said, "It is clear the UK Government's bill infringes on workers' fundamental employment rights, and I am deeply concerned that the bill would appear to grant powers to the UK Secretary of State to impose minimum service levels on transport operators and trade unions in Scotland." She went on to say, "The bill does not respect the Scottish Government's fair work principles of an effective voice, fulfilment, opportunity, respect and security. This would be an unacceptable erosion of the Scottish Government's devolved responsibility for transport in Scotland." She went on to say, "As governments, we should be working with transport operators and trade unions to reach fair and reasonable settlements, respecting the legitimate interest of workers and transport organisations." She continued, "The UK Government's introduction of this wholly unwelcome transport strikes minimum service levels bill is very likely to inflame rather than help resolve legitimate industrial disputes, which therefore will act against the interest of the travelling public." Scottish ministers would urge the UK Government to exclude Scotland from the transport strikes minimum service levels bill because there is no democratic mandate for the proposed approach in Scotland. Better still, the next Prime Minister who is appointed should instruct their Transport Minister to drop this bill altogether, she said. So another big complex story. I've got lots of notes written down here. Just in general, a wee bit background, employees in Scotland are more likely to be union members than in England. Apparently these things are measured in density, and in Scotland it's around about 30% of people in Scotland that have joined a union, whereas only 25% have joined a union in England. It seems the aim of this bill is to keep the country moving, even during the most disruptive strikes. But there's this kind of friction. I'll try and be quick, but transport in Scotland is devolved, as the Transport Minister said in Scotland. But Westminster say that this bill is to do with employment rights, which is reserved. So how do you see this kind of tussle being
Aye.
settled?
Well, well, the stated aim of the bill is to keep transport systems moving, but we all know the rhetoric that the UK government has been using in relation to trade unions. So there's also an aim of the bill is to hammer the trade unions because they have been vile in their talk about trade unions and workers, particularly over the rail strikes. The attack and devolution is quite serious here. Um, and, let's not forget that this has been something that the current UK government has been hammering at for a long time in lots of legislation. Is that right to actually impose things in Scotland? And Jenny Gilruth is quite right to have in the strongest terms denied this, not only because we do things differently here in Scotland, but because they can say all they like that it's employment. However, we run the trains and we run the transport systems in Scotland. So it should be the Scottish Government that deals with this. So, yes, away you go with your bill. Drop Scotland. I mean, it's an appalling bill anyway, what they're trying to do to trade unions and workers. They're just trying to emasculate their rights. So they should be dropping the whole thing. But the Scottish Government is charged with looking after Scotland. So she's quite right to be saying, drop Scotland from this. And I think that fight has to be ongoing. What I would also say is, again, Scottish Labour have to take some responsibility here and join with the Scottish National Party and with the Scottish Green Party. They're the ones that are always banging on about workers' rights. They're the ones who actually in the Smith Commission and subsequently have refused to argue for employment rights to be taken under the devolution settlement so that Scotland can make its own decision in these. So are they really going to sit back and allow the Tories to hammer away at unions and workers' rights in Scotland on a matter that should be devolved? So I think it's a really interesting question, but it's a big question for Scottish Labour to address here, because what they're doing is dumping on Scottish workers if they support this and allow this to go through. Without arguing Scotland's case.
Thank you, Linda. And just a couple of thoughts before we move on. I'm tempted to ask you if you'd be able to stay a wee bit later than usual if we're allowed to go overtime. But so I'll just say that from what you were saying, it's like I remember something you said made me remember that strikes are often used by the right to vilify workers. And it seems to me, again, just putting things in a wider context about the recent upheaval in Westminster, unions, if I'm right, must have 50% of the membership have got to vote to strike. Whereas this string of new prime ministers that we're in the middle of, they seem to get into power on much less than that. But anyway, there's actually news coming in hot off the press that I'd really like to be able to fit in, so we'd better move on. Sorry. So the next item, a Labour MP has resigned, triggering a by-election in his Chester seat after a report found he made unwanted and unwelcome sexual advances towards a junior member of staff. Parliament's Bullying and Harassment Watchdog, as well as the Standards Commissioner, found Chris Matheson had breached the sexual misconduct policy of the House of Commons. The independent expert panel, the IEP, subsequently recommended his suspension from Parliament for 4 weeks, but Matheson announced today that he had decided to stand down. Labour has suspended Matheson's Labour Party membership as well as launching an investigation. The Labour Chief Whip is understood to have spoken to Matheson, aged 54, and told him he should stand down as an MP and advised him to stay away from the parliamentary estate. In a statement, Matheson said he felt the suspension of 4 weeks was an excessive and unfair penalty, but he could not challenge it further and felt it was the honourable and right thing to stand down. He said the process had taken a toll on his health, including hospitalisation, and he was requesting privacy. Matheson also apologised to the people of Chester, the House of Commons, for the disrepute he had caused, and to the complainant for causing hurt. However, he also disputed the findings of the reports, saying there were provable factual inaccuracies and saying he had no sexual motivation in the matter. There were two main allegations upheld by Parliament Standards Commissioner. In the report by the IEP, it said that in 2019, Matheson had invited the junior staff member to take a private trip to Gibraltar with him. The Commissioner found that the invitation was sexually motivated, unwanted, and had placed the complainant under pressure and intimidated her. Secondly, it said Matheson took a junior staff member to a work-related dinner in January 2020 and during the evening linked arms with her, made personal comments about her appearance while looking at her suggestively, made her hold his hand as they left, and insisted on accompanying her to her bus stop. And once there, invited her back to his flat, kissed her twice on the forehead, and attempted to kiss her on the mouth. The Standards Commissioner concluded that these were all unwanted and unwelcome sexual advances. So just one thing that wasn't mentioned in the report there, Linda, that trip to Gibraltar, it didn't actually happen. But when they were talking about going on this trip, it seems that Matheson suggested that it should be kept private and maybe even used the word, let's keep it a secret. So we mentioned the talk of a by-election. He's got about a majority of about 6,000 majority, 6,100 and so. But do you think this has got more to say about parliamentary standards?
Oh, gosh, there's been so much of it, Brian, across the parties, I have to say. It's about, yes, it's, parliamentary standards. But part of that is what has been there from time immemorial. It's a power abuse. It's been happening. I mean, but we've seen it in all sorts of walks of life. The abuse of power with those who hold it and who have control over the lives and futures of others who don't have the power but who come within their sway. I haven't read too closely about Chris Matheson's particular issues, but it just sounds, very typical. The allegations that have been found justified by the parliamentary authorities just sound very, very typical of what you hear when you have people in positions of power that think they're untouchable and who try to take advantage of those who don't have power. It's usually men with power against younger women. That has certainly historically been the case. We are hearing more allegations now, of course, of abuse of power by men against usually younger or junior men as well. I guess that has always happened, but it's just talked about more thankfully than it ever had been before. I'm just glad people now speak out. And, for all those who say, oh, it's minor, you should probably deal with it, for goodness sake, think back to when you were a youngster, when you were looking at people who were your bosses and everything else. It is not easy to turn around and say to someone who holds power over you, uh, to stop it. It's difficult to deal with, and I don't think we should ever downplay how difficult that can actually be. So
Yeah.
yes, there's an issue at Westminster, but there's people there, a lot of people there, who have a lot of power, who believe they're untouchable, and sadly, for many, many years, were untouchable in these circumstances. It's comparatively recently that this stuff has started to get into the public domain.
Yeah, apparently when he said it wasn't sexually motivated, he said he meant it to be fatherly, but which then again just makes me think about the patriarchy, which should be
Well,
abolished in my opinion. But
aye.
we'd better move on if we're going to fit in a really important news story that's coming in.
You've got
So
me wondering what on earth is happening, Brian.
Oh, it's interesting. No, definitely. I'm really hoping that we will get permission to maybe, if you're willing, Linda, if we can maybe like go a wee bit over time, but we'll see how we got.
Mhm.
I'll try and read a wee bit faster and try and stop interjecting as well. So, a charter airline hired to remove people seeking refuge in the UK to Rwanda has pulled out of the scheme after pressure from campaigners. A plane operated by Privilege Style first attempted to fly asylum seekers to the East African country in June, but was grounded by an 11th hour ruling by the European Court of Human Rights. The Mallorca-based carrier had become known as the UK government's airline of last resort for its willingness to conduct deportation flights that other airlines refused. But after an email campaign by torture survivors and refugee organisations, Privileged Style has said it will no longer operate flights to Rwanda. The government will leave the UK government. This development will leave the UK government needing to find another carrier after Titan Airways and Air Tanker charter airlines that had previously conducted deportation flights had already ruled themselves out of the scheme. In a letter to the charity Freedom from Torture, which has led the campaign under the hashtag Stop the Flights, Privileged Style said it hereby wishes to communicate the following: that it will not operate flights to Rwanda in the future, that it has never flown to Rwanda since the one flight scheduled for June 2022, which is the reason for this controversy, was suspended. Privileged Style's statement followed an escalation in public protests against it by campaigners. Last week, activists from Freedom from Torture presented the firm with Worst Airline of the Year award at the carrier's headquarters in Palma in front of the media. So, Linda, if we want to get onto this news story that's coming up, I don't know. It's like we often hear the refrain of things like "I don't vote," "Politicians are all the same," doesn't make any difference. But this is a good example of that we can make a difference. And of course, I'm tempted to just remind people of the toxic nature of this policy with the recent asylum seeker who fell pregnant after being raped, who the government want to take to send to Rwanda. So you can't blame any airline company from wanting to step back from this, can you?
Well, first of all, can I say well done the campaigners, you know. I often say to people, every little bit helps, you know. Every little brick you put in that wall can help build that wall. So I'm really pleased that this airline has pulled out of this. I hope it stops this horrendous policy. I mean, unfortunately, most of the Tory leadership candidates last time around were still in support of it. I really hope that one of them, at least, will turn around and say, right, it's time to ditch this. Nasty, disgusting, horrible, cruel policy. I'm glad that this airline has pulled out. I'm glad that no others have stepped forward and said that they will take these flights. So let's hope that's the end of it and it's done.
Thank you, Linda. And again, I've got the First Minister's words ringing in my ear when she recently said that she detested such policies as this. So the next item is Donald Trump's right-wing former strategist Steve Bannon was sentenced to 4 months in federal prison and $6,500 in fines today, following his conviction for criminal contempt of Congress for refusing to comply with a subpoena issued by the House in January. Sorry, I'll read that again. I'm going too fast for my own good. Following his conviction for criminal contempt of Congress for refusing to comply with a subpoena issued by the House January 6 Select Committee last year. The punishment makes Bannon the first person to be jailed for contempt of Congress in more than half a century and sets the standard for future and additional contempt cases referred to the Justice Department by the Select Committee investigating the Capitol attack. Sentence handed down by the US District Court Judge Carol Nichols in Washington was lighter than recommended by prosecutors who sought 6 months in jail and the maximum $200,000 in fines because Bannon refused to cooperate with court officials pre-sentencing inquiries. Bannon had asked the court for leniency and requested in court filings for his sentence to be halted pending the appeal. His lawyers filed briefs that the DC Circuit Court, Thursday or otherwise, have the jail term reduced to home confinement, but the requests were denied. And maybe just to put you out of your misery, Linda, I'll lump in this hot off the press story, which has just been handed to me. The Select Committee for the 6th of January committee has subpoenaed the former President Donald Trump today. It's a historic, if largely symbolic step that is likely to compel Trump's testimony before the panel dissolves at the end of the year. The Select Committee subpoenaed former President Donald Trump today That step is unlikely to compel Trump's testimony before the panel dissolves at the end of the year. This Politico release says it's just the second time in modern US history that Congress has taken such a step. The subpoena gives Trump until the 4th of November to produce documents and sets the 14th of November as a deposition date. Linda, I'm sorry for lumping two stories connected there. What are your,
Aye. Well, they're
you,
like two peas in a pod, that pair, aren't they? So,
and you heard it here
yeah.
first.
Yeah. Well, Steve Bannon, he's just contemptuous. Not he's contempt of Congress. He's a contemptuous person anyway. I see he's appealing, but I thought it was also interesting, Brian, that the judge that sentenced him today was actually a Trump appointee, which I thought was quite interesting. So that's Bannon. Could well be going to jail, and now we've got Trump subpoena. Do you know? I haven't closely watched everything to do with this, but I did watch a video last week that had gone to the select committee, where they're trying to determine whether Trump was instrumental in these riots, etc. And I was quite horrified by the stuff that I did see. Absolutely horrendous. I'm also horrified at the contempt with which Trump treats everybody other than himself. What a character he is, a nasty, devious, horrible character. So it'll be interesting to see what he now does now that he's been subpoenaed. What's that, 4th November? That's not far away. And given, 10 days till the deposition date. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with this. But I'm really, really pleased that the members of the select committee are just not letting this go because it's serious. And what really stuns me are the amount of people that still come out and support Donald Trump. It just fascinates me. And you wonder what kind of hold this kind of complete narcissistic character can have over people. Why do they think he's a great guy when any normal thinking person just looks at him and wants to give him a wide berth and wouldn't let him near anything? So, this story's going to run and run.
Yeah, and I think if I remember rightly, the word Christmas was mentioned in that press release, and so maybe it is going to be an early Christmas present. And again, just before we move on, my question to you before the Trump news came in, when it was just Bannon was our news item tonight, my question to you was going to be, will Trump be on the edge of his seat this evening or squirming on hearing this news? And so I think I've probably answered one question, a rhetorical question, shall we say. And again, just
I
thinking
don't know.
back.
Does
On you
he
go.
squirm? I don't know.
Yeah, good point.
The narcissist that the man is, does
Yeah,
he ever suffer from self-doubt?
yeah,
Does he ever have empathy for anyone else? I'm
yeah,
not convinced he does. So he
yeah. So
probably doesn't give a toss about Steve Bannon, to be honest.
yeah, and again,
Probably doesn't think it'll ever affect him.
what's ringing in my ears at the moment, inside my head, not the voice in my ear, which is different. That's separate. But what was it? Trump supporters used to chant and bellow at Hillary Clinton. Was it "lock her up"? Lock her up, and so maybe they're going to get a taste of their own medicine. So, so the
Well, we'll see.
final, yeah, we'll see. Time will tell. So the final story of the evening, which hopefully we can squeeze in, a consultation has been launched on how qualifications and assessments should be reformed to ensure learners' achievements are fairly recognised. Young people, parents, carers, teachers, education staff and all learners are among those being encouraged to give their views. The consultation invites opinions on the balance between exams and other forms of assessment, how a wider range of learners' achievements can be recognised, potential use of technology in assessment and qualifications, how to ensure that qualifications enable all learners, regardless of their circumstances, to demonstrate their strengths and achievements. That was the final bullet point there. The consultation, which will close on 16th of December, is part of an independent review of qualifications and assessments announced by Education Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville in October 2021. The review is being led by Louise Hayward, Emetria Professor of Educational Assessment and Innovation at Glasgow University, who will provide independent advice for ministers to consider in March next year. Education Secretary Shirley-Anne Somerville said, "The aim of reforming qualifications and assessment is to ensure that all senior phase learners have the best possible opportunity to demonstrate the breadth and depth and relevance of their learning." I'll just say that this, in my mind, it seems that in the past, exams have favoured people that have got a good memory and can cram facts and figures, like hours before they go in to sit an exam. And it seems that that model that is kind of becoming outmoded. Do you think, does this somehow relate to the move away from, like, and it's not the same, but the way that the Scottish government wants to move away from measuring the strength of the economy by GDP, which is just a number, and maybe using a well-being
Yeah.
economy, and this is more like a well-being measure?
Do you know, that's a really interesting concept, Brian. I hadn't actually thought of that, but yeah, I see what you're getting at. When I saw that this was coming out, I was thinking about it quite a lot, recognizing that I'm of a generation that finds it quite difficult to get beyond good grammar and maths and and stuff. Um, an old fogey when it comes to things like that. But we have to recognise that time has changed. Times have changed. So maybe it is time for a proper review on how we assess all these things. I haven't read the detail of it yet, but I mean, one of the things I think quite a lot now is that information is so easy to come by. Answers to things are just on hand in a mobile phone. Da, da, da. There isn't the necessity to actually cram to remember things and fill your brain with stuff that perhaps later in life you won't need. So, yeah, maybe folk like me and others have to recognise times have changed. It is perfectly acceptable to be using, you know, I don't know, what the internet and things like that to get your information, to be doing research. Maybe you don't have to memorise everything. There's also the issue about parity of esteem for different kinds of skills that I don't think we've ever got really to grips with in our society either, like they have in some other European countries. So yeah, I think there's a lot there. I'm going to look at it quite closely. Um, and try and get beyond my own thinking that a slide rule and a calculator were something that you shouldn't use in an exam. So I do think there's an awful lot there that can be worthwhile. I hope it's taken very seriously because sometimes I think we have all these consultations and reviews and nothing much happens. But this is a very, very important one. And I hope it's taken very seriously and taken on board by those that make the decisions.
Thank you, Linda. And you're more than welcome to come back here and let us, share your thoughts once you've, done that thinking about, slide rules and calculators, because you're absolutely right. And also,
Do you
yeah,
know, there's probably half our viewership will not even know what a slide rule is.
yes, or a calculator even. But just a couple of weeks. I think we've got a minute or two left. The voice in my ear reminded us of a better analogy, but in the same kind of like well-being ballpark. Recently at the SNP conference, the decision to raise the school starting age kind of also is
Mm,
kind of part of this. Maybe it's got like a
mhm,
and also, I'm just
mm,
thinking back to remember all that trouble during the pandemic with the hires results and the O levels results, and people couldn't sit
uh,
exams, and so again, maybe just that is part of that prescriptive, old-fashioned, outmoded thing. Post-pandemic, we need to go right back to basics and rebuild the education system from the bottom up. No.
Well, I do think that. I think the pandemic really made us think an awful lot about that kind of stuff as well. And again, let's use it as an opportunity to have learned lessons about how things can be better. And it wasn't just a learning process for pupils and learners. I've heard a lot of teachers, college and university lecturers say that they learned a lot from it as well in relation to how education can be delivered. And we should take the good stuff from that. I certainly don't think we should ever replace face-to-face learning with learning by screen entirely. Of course, I don't. But I do think that we can be uh, a bit more, a bit more pragmatic about what suits people best and what is the best way forward.
Thank you, Linda. Well, that is it for this evening. Oh, yeah, I've been asked, the voice in my ear has just asked me to, more hot off the press news. The YouGov's latest data, I'm guessing that means we're allowed to go over. I hope you can stay with us, Linda. YouGov's latest data reveals that a referendum on Scottish independence would now be too close to call, with 49%
Oh,
backing independence and 51% opposing it. For that, although it might sound bad, and I'm thinking it's within the margin of error, but that's actually but from YouGov, if you compare their past results, that's an increase of, sorry, 3%? It's 4% on for independence. So
that's good. I'm glad to
yes,
hear that. It'll be interesting to look at the breakdown and the demographics on that one. But when you consider where we were before our last referendum, that's pretty good going.
yeah. And does it include 16 and 17-year-old voters? Yeah, absolutely. So
Yeah, that's what we need to be looking at.
yeah,
Mhm.
Linda, thank you for this evening, giving us
Thank
time
you.
out of your Friday night. I'll let you start your weekend now. The same goes for our viewers. I'll let you all start your weekend now as well. Um, so, before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So, to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Speaking of which, speaking of programmes being free to view, Andrew Wilson will be hosting Full Scottish on Sunday. Meanwhile, we have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. So please help us to do that. So it just takes, just to thank Linda once again, before I say good night and thank you for watching. Bye-bye.